Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our first session about our public policy priorities and our new strategic plan, as well as an introduction to finding treatments and a cure. So I'm Nicole Eck, and I'm the Vice President of Operations for the ALS Association. I'm going to be joining on and off for the next few days, helping us to manage some question and answer sessions. So I'm here to briefly share with you how to ask a question. So in the upper right hand of your screen, you should see just a little question box, and it says Q&A. If you click on that Q&A box, a larger box where you can type a question will come up. Hopefully you've written down some of your questions or noted some of your questions during our first session. And you can type in your questions whenever you're ready, and we will run through them. We may not get to all of your questions, but we will certainly do our best. And then all of our speakers today will join us in our Q&A session after our presentations are done. And we will have a good 20-minute discussion. So I will turn this stage back over to Colleen, who will present us with our first community impact moment.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So we have a special, I think, some special guests for you. We wanted to kind of do a fireside chat, and I love that Carrie took that literally and is sitting in front of her fireside. So I am really pleased to be joined by Carrie Meisterick and Troy Field. So let me just tell you a little bit about them, and then we'll get going. So Carrie used to manage a specialty laboratory as part of a hemophilia clinic, which I thought was really interesting at UT. And before she took a full-time leave and full-time position as a mom and a homeschool teacher. And Carrie was diagnosed with ALS at the age of 28 and has been living with ALS since 1998. She's served as a NEALS research ambassador, has participated in a clinical trial, and I think at least 10 or a dozen other types of research trials as well. Carrie, I want to thank you because I know you've been participating on the association's ALS Focus program and our patient and caregiver advisory committee. So thanks and welcome. And then Troy Fields, welcome Troy. He hails from Florida, and I won't. They have how old you are in here, but I'm not going to tell anyone that. That's just not nice. But he is a person who's been living with ALS since June of 2018. Troy used to work at FIS, a global financial technology company. He was there for 26 years. So I just gave away a little bit of your age, but that's it. And Troy is also a member of the chapter board in Florida. And I just want to thank you for all that you're doing. So for those of you who may have joined us or may have watched the recording from the FDA meeting, you heard from both Carrie and Troy and many others living with ALS, and they just gave unbelievable, heartfelt comments, and they were very powerful directly to FDA and our FDA colleagues. So I really want to thank you for that, because I know it had a great impact, and we're very excited about the work that's happening in that area. But today we wanted to talk about making ALS a livable disease and how we get there. And I just preface by saying we didn't ask Carrie and Troy to just speak in support of this plan. I really want to hear their thoughts, concerns, what you all are thinking as we talk through some of these words. So are you both ready to get started? All right, great. So Carrie, I'm going to throw the first question to you. When you think of ALS being a livable disease, can you share what that means to you?
Sure. I have 4 kids, and they're all in their 20s, and ALS being a livable disease, to me personally, is having the chance for more game nights, more movie nights, more picnics in the mountains, and the chance for more adventures and long drives with my husband. In order to have this chance, we not only do we have to have more promising treatments developed and in the pipeline, but we have to, all patients have to have access to these treatments. We need more options and we need access. We need to keep working for that access with FDA as Livable. We don't want to just be breathing. We want to be having a good quality of life. Having resources available for everyone to make that happen will make ALS more livable.
Thank you, Carrie. That's yeah, I think we agree. Troy, what about you? What do you think about?
Well, to me, the key is in the word livable, and I get that a lot of different connotations for different people. But me specifically, it's not to survive, it's not to exist, it's to live. That's the key root of that word. So I look at that as not just but to be able to put some life in that time that I have. So it's a hopeful message. I know it's not an easy message, but it's a hopeful one.
Thanks, Troy. So I want to switch a little bit to burden. And you heard Neil earlier talk a little bit about the burdens that people face. But I'm curious as to the ones that you both face and that you want to speak about. So, Carrie, I'm going to come back to you and ask, would you want to talk about some of the burdens that we should be focusing on in particular? You've been living with this disease for a very long time now, and I'm very curious to kind of hear what your thoughts are here.
I think the greatest need is for caregiver support. Financially, especially, because without some kind of state or federal assistance with the cost of caregiving, people simply can't afford the higher the help they need. And then that takes not just a financial toll, but the physical and emotional toll on your caregivers. So we desperately need that kind of support. And, we're fortunate that, my kids were able to help out for a long time. And we were fortunate we got hire caregivers and allow my husband to keep working. But as I progress, we don't know what will happen. He may need to be home more. And there's just so many scary financial things if he can't be working. We need financial support.
Thanks, Carrie. I think that's I know it's something that I hear every day from people all over the country, really all over the world, that the financial burden turns into an emotional, physical, all the burdens all rolled up into one. So I appreciate your comments. Troy, I'm wondering if you have anything else you'd like to add or sprinkle in.
Yeah, absolutely. Initially, some of the challenges are obvious, right? There's a challenge in the science. If the science was easy, we would have found the cure by now. There is a challenge at the advocacy front to just provide the necessary funds for research and beyond that, an equal level of care across the various providers, Medicare, VA, private, and so there's a challenge in that care side as well. But financially, as Carrie mentioned, that gap we don't focus too much about it, but we live with it every day, and it's bad enough when you're unable to provide for your family the way that you're used to. You're not able to do the way that you used to, and then you add some of the you have the physical challenges and barriers we got to overcome, and then you add to that the financial burden as well. And none of these challenges are going to be easy, but they're equally important. So I think the challenge, even from an association standpoint, is how to balance all of these things that are pulling in different directions on limited resources, and just trying to figure out how to break out of that so that we can take care of each one of those items in the research, advocacy, and the care to the patients and caregivers.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Troy, and it's funny when you say balance, because we're always trying to balance everything, both with the association and even in our own homes, right? And it's that constant combination of trying to follow the research and the advocacy and really leverage things at the greatest rate possible. So I appreciate that thought. So I want to stick with this burden concept a little bit. And Troy, I want to ask you something. I hope it's fair to ask how your life might be a bit different without some of the burdens that you're mentioning. So anything that you think about that you want to just highlight and share with everyone?
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is, it would be a normal life. It's the life that I was used to living prior to my diagnosis. Throwing ball with my grandkids and hugging my family, playing with the dog, playing guitar. I mean, those things that make for what we might consider a normal life. Working, but even without being so aspirational, perhaps more practical, perhaps very selfishly looking at it from my perspective, if I was able to, at the very least, stop the progression where I'm now, and I may still work around in a wheelchair and so on, but at least I'm able to interact with my family, interact with my friends, have some level of quality of life. And so I don't want to be too greedy, and so I want it all back. That would be ideal, but even some semblance of normalcy, where I can, be able to function as close to the folks that are around me, are able to as well. That would be fantastic. And that's why I go back to what I was saying before about livable. It's not just simply about existing. It's about a sense of normalcy, if you will, in terms of our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, thank you, Troy. Carrie, do you have anything to add there?
I just totally agree with Troy. I want my old life back. If that's not possible, I want to maintain what I've got. I'm I can be happy and content right where I'm at, but the thought of continuing the progress is a real, fear and a real reality. I've been stable for so many years, and this last year, I'm finally seeing all the normal changes, and that's very scary. And that's what all my fellow pals deal with every day.
Thanks, Carrie. So I'm just going to pivot a little bit because, we're at the Advocacy Conference. You all know how important this is in actually trying to get to the goals that you just talked about. I don't know if you saw the first session, but we started, we are joined by 900 people right now. Yeah, across the country. And 500 of them are people living with ALS and their loved ones. So I wondered if I know you all have been to the Hill, both virtually and non-virtually. And I was wondering if you had one pro tip to give to our folks that are embarking on this new adventure with us. So Troy, I'll start with you and then turn it over to Carrie.
My one piece of advice is don't be starstruck. They put their pants one leg at a time, as the cliche goes. But it's really about being authentic, honest, and tell your story. Nobody knows your story better than you are. So you don't have to be an expert in policy. You got to just be an expert about your life and your story, and let that just come through. And then the rest will follow.
Excellent tip. Yes, it can be a little scary at first, but I like the one leg at a time pants situation. Carrie, what's your pro tip?
Like Troy, they're people, and they have hearts, and hearing your stories, it will move them. They're gonna wanna do whatever they can for you. And I think, we all get our talking points and things that we're asking for. And what's been helpful to weave in my story when I talk is whichever one of the points or asks really resonates with me or where we're at as a family. That's the one I pick that talk about because I can relate to it the most, and maybe give personal examples of, but yeah, just tell your story and don't be afraid.
Great tips from both of you. I couldn't agree more, Carrie. When they hear from you and they hear what your story really is, it makes the legislation, while it seems antiseptic, really, really important. So thank you both. We could sit here and talk for a very long time. And frankly, in all candor, Troy and Carrie and I have. We've spent a lot of time talking together. So I just want to thank you both for joining us for this little bit of time, for giving a little bit of your thoughts and your background and your pro tips. And now we're going to kind of pivot our program a little bit. And I want to introduce Dr. Jinzi Anders. Dr. Anders is the Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials at Columbia University and is also a member of the ALS Association Board of Trustees. And so Dr. Anders is going to tell us a little bit more about the association's research programs. So Jinzi, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Kelly. And I think it's really important to emphasize that the association's research is really pivoting around the perspectives actually shared by Carrie and Troy, and I really want to thank them for providing the perspective of what it means to be livable, to make ALS livable. It really does take a lot of work, and I wanted to take a minute to share the landscape that's evolving in ALS research. So not only do I have the privilege of caring for people living with ALS at Columbia University and participating as a board member for the ALS Association, I'm also the co-chair of a clinical trial consortium called NEALS. And so I have a little bit of a broad picture of what's happening in the landscape and what we're doing now to really make ALS livable, and how the association is a critical component in their strategic mission. We've talked about finding new treatments and cures. And so part of trying to do that is to do more clinical trials, but we want to do it more efficiently and more rapidly. And so what's happening now, and what's on the slide here, is that we've learned from doing many, many clinical trials that everyone living with ALS does not have the same disease, and that one size doesn't fit all. And we need to learn as we do clinical trials to fit potential investigational drugs to particular populations. And so we do that by learning about the subsets of disease and maybe even stratifying populations into particular treatment regimens, or actually finding a subset and understanding maybe how the disease evolves and targeting a particular drug specifically for those individuals and targeting it like precision medicine. And if we do it that way, we believe that we could actually find more impactful therapy. And so if you go to the next slide, what I'm going to give you is in 10 minutes, years worth of research. And so I'm going to try to cram it and give you high level kind of big picture, because things that we didn't think we could do are now happening, and really has been a collaborative effort on the association's part, not only funding this type of research, but also working with other organizations to really push things forward and push it aggressively now. Although our mission talks about 2030, I want to make it clear there are a lot of pivotal things happening right now to try to change what we're doing. And that's not just with the association, but with clinical trialists, researchers, the voice of people living with ALS becoming part of the conversation, not only with advocacy, but with regulators and with scientists to kind of help even design clinical trials. So this slide kind of emphasizes how that transition is happening. And so this is a diagram of the platform trial, which is a version of what's called an adaptive trial design. And inherently, the big picture here is not necessarily the details on the slide, but the fact that there are so many different investigational drugs that we think could be helpful in the disease. But it will take a long time to test each individual drug one at a time, for one trial to start, then to test it, and then to end it, and then do the second drug sequentially. The other part is that it's inefficient. We have to take more people in and evaluate that potential drug and see if it works. And in order to cut down the time to test a drug, cut down the number of people needed to test each individual therapy, we use an adaptive trial design. So the platform trial is one such example. There are other innovative designs for many other trials, but this is just one example. This allows us to put drugs in as they come up. And so there are currently 4 drugs that are being tested in the platform trial. And eventually there are 2 others coming along the way. But it helps us to cut down the time to see if a drug has a potential effect on the disease. So short 6-month trial. And then it also affords the opportunity for people within that trial to participate in an open label extension. So open label extension means patient knows that they're getting drug, the physician knows they're getting drug, and it's an increasing access to potential investigational therapies. But also it conserves the number of people that are exposed to placebo. We've heard over and over again, we need to be innovative with our trial designs to either remove placebo arms or try to use them in a way that conserves the exposure, so shorter times, crossover designs, or using clever randomization technique. And we're trying to incorporate that all right now in our trial designs. And most importantly, in doing these clinical trial designs, we do commonly, and in the case of this platform trial design, we have people living with ALS and their caregivers informing us at the stage of design, at the stage of execution, and also at the stage of trying to give us feedback about the study. So I think in that way, it shows that the field is transitioning the way we've done clinical trials traditionally and moving forward. If we go to the next slide, I mentioned that potential drugs will be impactful if we know what we're targeting. And so these are just examples of very large multi-center consortiums that have been developed. One is at Columbia University, led by Dr. Matthew Harms. One is at Johns Hopkins called Answer ALS, led by Dr. Rothstein and his team. And then also CREATE Consortium, which is led by Dr. Michael Benatar at University of Miami. These are all looking at clinical data, and these are observational studies. So if you have an opportunity to participate in observational studies, it's important. We've learned so much. When someone comes in to see me and they say, how did you come to the diagnosis? What am I to expect? What are things that can impact or have be factors in my disease progression? Things like having good nutritional care, things like taking care of respiratory issues are not minor. They do modify disease progression if you actually take care of this. And we learned those through these observational studies. And so these consortiums help to understand clinical data, get genetic data and other biomarker data that can help understand these subsets, find potential targets, and maybe even find subsets of patients that could be a good fit for a potential target or an investigational therapy. If you go to the next slide, I think the other real important resource for the community is this kind of open access database. So when a clinical trial completes and it didn't work, is that a failure? If the drug fails, fine. But what we do get is data, and that data has helped us in so many ways. People I don't think really appreciate it. And so getting clinical trial data and putting it in a resource, whether that's a clinical trial run by a clinical trialist or an investigator, or if it's a pharmaceutical sponsored clinical trial, it's important to put it in a resource and have it accessible to the whole community so that we can understand subsets of patient populations, trying to actually use that data to simulate future clinical trials. And that's been critically important in developing other endpoints, trying to predict endpoints, and understanding other data or biomarkers or serum samples, urine samples that can help us make efficient clinical trials moving forward. And so this is very, very critical. I think I would also like to highlight that in trying to do research and trying to create efficient ways of doing it and granting access, there are a couple of other things I didn't put on slides. One is that, the association is very critical to funding postdoctorates or trainees, pulling people from other fields that might have specialties to bring new ideas, or trying to bring young people into ALS so they can actually be the future of conducting clinical trials. Why do I think this is important? I myself got a grant, and that was the reason why I stayed in ALS to conduct clinical trials. It's so important, especially in a field like ALS. The second is that I think it's underappreciated that the funding and resources provided by the association to the care centers and the local chapters and their value to people living with ALS. I'm at Columbia University. I have an ALS Center of Excellence, and it is essential to providing optimal care. So in doing the research, we hope to find new therapies. We incorporate that into our clinics, and we hope to provide optimal, standardized care to all patients. So I really hope that I was able to share with you just a few nuggets of really pivotal research that's going to transform the landscape for access, for finding new treatments and cures, to look at observational data sets so that we can identify potential causes of ALS, or maybe even find things that we can prevent so that it prevents ALS or prevent harms for people living with ALS. And also that this whole objective will hopefully help to optimize care and treatment at the centers of excellence supported by the ALS Association. So with that, I will conclude, and I will turn it over to Neil Thacker to continue this conversation.
Thanks, Jinzi. I really appreciate that. That was a really exciting overview of some of the complex changes that are happening in the clinical trial space pretty quickly. And so I just wanted to bring us back up a level, back to our public policy priorities and how they fit together. So one of the things we're looking for here is to accelerate the development and approval and access to new effective treatments. And so we have two pieces of legislation that are going to help speed that up. And one is the Act for ALS. And this is going to help people access treatments while they're still in the experimental phase through expanded access. There's funding for that. There's also funding for additional research as well. So we're both growing the base of research and growing the accessibility to those treatments under research. The second is a Promising Pathways Act. This is taking a concept which is working in Europe, a provisional approval where the FDA approves a drug on the hope that things are working, but while that drug is getting into market, there's additional research being done to really finalize and solidify the research, the evidence base for that drug. And if the research proves what we hope it to prove, the drug stays on the market. And if it doesn't, if the drug turns out not to work, the FDA has the confidence that they can take that drug back off the market very quickly and efficiently. And so those are both key pieces of evidence. There's key pieces of legislation that can make things faster. And then again, I wanted to remind you of our big asks for funding, which are supporting the research space. We have funding for research from multiple federal programs. And as I showed to you in that pipeline graph, these programs do target specific parts of the ALS research space, even in cases where it looks like there's some overlap, where the circles overlap. The program managers still talk to each other. Kuldip, our head of research, talks to all of them. They do coordinate, so the research really is complementary. ALS is still a relatively small research community, and there is the opportunity for that coordination, and it does happen. I think what we also need, and what we have a good potential for, is to speed up, add more volume, but also add more focus. And that's where that National Academy study comes in. And so those are the messages that we hope you can convey to Congress, because we do have a way to get new treatments and cures faster than we've been doing before. And that's what this part of the agenda is about. So I want to thank you and turn things back, I believe, to Nicole, where we're going to have an opportunity to have some questions.
Thank you, Neil. I'm going to actually just take a moment to remind you, if you wanted to ask a question, to go to the upper right-hand portion of your screen and find that little Q&A button. We do have a whole bunch of questions that have already come in throughout our discussion here with Carrie and Troy, as well as hearing from both Neil and Jinzi, as well as our earlier session with Connie and Kathleen. So thank you all. It's been a very engaging presentation so far, and I've certainly learned some things myself. But I want to get our Q&A session going. So we'll go ahead and bring back some of our speakers from today. So we'll have Neil Thacker, of course, and Colleen Balas, as well as Carrie and Troy are going to join us again, along with Jinzi. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a question that just came in specific to some news that broke yesterday, actually. So the question is around the drug, and I'm going to see if I can actually pronounce it really quick, aducanumab. And what is the ALS Association doing to leverage today's FDA approval specific to that drug for Alzheimer's disease, but pressing for FDA regulatory flexibility for such ALS drugs as Neuron or Amylyx? And Neil, I'm going to actually send that question over to you to start us off.
Yeah, thank you. The FDA has been taking a lot of heat from the scientific community about this drug. There have been several editorials attacking them for being too permissive and being too flexible. And at the same time, we've been giving them the opposite message, that they're not fast enough, that they're not flexible enough. And so for them to approve this drug, I'm seeing as a good sign, because they are showing some flexibility. Now, the question in my mind that I'm very concerned with is, will they show the same flexibility in the ALS space? Every drug is different. Every disease is different. And so, you could have 6 experts look at this and give you 6 different opinions. Our opinion, and we've been pushing the FDA hard on this, is that they should be as flexible as possible for ALS because of the dire conditions of ALS and because of the lack of treatments. And what we're trying to emphasize to them is that the community has been very clear that they're willing to accept a high degree of risk for even a modest benefit. And we have to hold them to that. And we've been working on that all week. And Jinzi and Colleen have both had some very high-level discussions about that. And so I'm sure they have other insights on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Colleen.
So Jinzi and I both have had several conversations. I think, I want to take this as positive news that the agency is thinking in flexible and interesting directions. I think it's been directly related to some of the conversations that Jinzi and I have had with some high-level officials at FDA. And I think it's also important and maybe good to remember that the conversation or controversy around this drug has been going on for quite some time. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 1.5 to 2 years. And that might have given us, I'm hoping it'll give us a little bit of runway time in how they saw and the path forward for this particular drug. So that's how I've been looking at it. We will continue to lean in on the situation, as you've seen us been doing for several weeks, if not months now. Jinzi, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I can add is that given the situation at hand now, we can leverage that in our conversations moving forward, especially for things that we have been already in discussions with, but also for things coming down the pipeline in terms of clinical trial results, and really pushing our regulatory partners to really think about any kind of clinical trial results in the context of ALS. I think we're now, in front of them. They're hearing us, they're listening, and it's our job as a community to come together and kind of send that message.
Yep.
Thank you both, and or actually all 3 of you, for answering that complex question. But it is a question that's come through a few times today, as we would expect from the news this week. So the next question, I actually would like to address a few questions that I'm getting specific to the recording of our presentations today, as well as the presentation slides. So folks are really curious about some of the slides, like the pipeline slide and some others. And so we just wanted to let you know we will be making the slides available to you, and we'll try and make them available to you as soon as possible. And I know that the recording of today's session will be available immediately on the website. So the next question that we have, and I think I'll send this question over to you, Colleen. How is the ALS Association, if we're keeping in the theme of the FDA here, how are we working with the FDA specifically to try and modify clinical trial endpoints so that we can recognize incremental improvements that are so meaningful to people with ALS?
Sure, I'm happy to take a first stab, and I know that I can even see Jinzi's face and Neil too have some thoughts. So I think it's first important to remind people that the guidance, the framework of that guidance actually provides for this. And I think what we've seen in the last several weeks and conversations is, the ALS Association has said, we're not really comfortable that the FDA is committed to that. So in the recent letter that I sent, I did ask for FDA to really have a recommitment so that we all hear it again, and even to report on how this guideline might be used or has been used so far. So that's one piece. I know the other things that we're working on, we're constantly talking with FDA, as Jinzi and I just mentioned. We're also focused on how do we expand kind of the evidence base of what people living with ALS really want. So I mentioned that Carrie's been part of our ALS Focus program. We have a lot of people living with ALS that are, if we provide that evidence, so it's evidence-based to FDA and say, look, these aren't just anecdotal conversations we're having these with thousands of people who are telling us the same thing, that can also help with their thinking and how they move forward. So those are a couple thoughts off the top of my head, but Jinzi or Neil, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think I can just add that, I went quickly over some of the innovations and collaborations in the field. I want to emphasize that, yes, our endpoints are the endpoints we have commonly, their survival and ALS functional rating scale. And I think it's important for people to know that the clinical trials that are ongoing now, they also include other measures to try to find two things. One, are these incremental improvements? So if something is missed by those two endpoints that have not been perfect, but that's what we have to work with, we are looking at other biomarkers, so serum, spinal fluid, urine markers within these clinical trials. We're also testing out other evaluations. So there's other versions of almost like the ALS FRS called the ROADS. There's digital technology to look at speech and breathing at home, to look at those incremental measures, looking at muscle strength. Some of these are included already in like muscle strength testing and respiratory testing within the guidance actually that was finalized. So I should point that out. But those are things that are incorporated to find ways to look at those incremental changes. So that's one. The second part is looking at, if we include a whole broad population, trying to identify subsets of patients before the study. So if we think a drug would work in a small group of people, identifying that population before a study begins and a priori analyzing those people at the end. So understanding like responders. So I think both of those strategies are being incorporated now in clinical trials.
Thank you, Colleen and Jinzi. I appreciate that. Jinzi, I'm going to keep you on stage for just a minute here to answer our next question. And so assuming that we get some promising treatments or trials, how can we get PALs involved and in those trials, and not just those fortunate enough to live nearby the medical ALS facilities required?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I highlighted the platform trial, so one is trying to figure out how can we broaden the inclusion-exclusion criteria so that we can appropriately judge an effect of a drug. So the platform trial does have an expanded clinical trial eligibility criteria. So that's one way to increase access. The second is trying to figure out how to set up sites. So part of what I do actually outside of the association at NEALS is trying to encourage young investigators to develop centers in regions that don't have places that conduct clinical trials. So training them as investigators, but also helping their sites get set up. And that's true for the US and also in Canada and some parts of Europe. So trying to get those people set up, number one. Number two, trying to think of ways to do clinical trials so that we have broadened number of centers. We have remote ways of assessing people or screening people so that they have an opportunity no matter where they live, and also trying to create support for travel to those centers. So if they need support, whether it's financial or transportation, we can get them there, or trying to minimize the number of times people have to go to this center and being efficient so that it's not such a burden. And that's really based on feedback from people who've been through the clinical trial process and helping to improve, and partly because of COVID and the limitations of access to the centers. So although it did have to change everything we have to do, it really didn't stop our clinical trials. We had to revamp it so that we use things like remote assessments, remote telemedicine, to do the visits from people's homes. And so those kind of factors we've tried to incorporate into designs going forward.
Thank you, Jinzi. And, we're getting a lot of questions here about clinical trials specifically. And so, and I think this is a really interesting question regarding sort of the stages of the disease. So if the diagnosis, as an example, Jinzi, and maybe Neil, you might want to join us on this question as well. If the diagnosis is delayed until someone has reached an advanced stage of the disease, clinical trials typically are no longer an option. So do we envision that there might be future options for those in a more advanced stage of the disease?
You know, we have had, I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in there. We have had instances where people say using a non-invasive ventilator were allowed in certain clinical trials. And it's really dependent on the mechanism of the drug and what we're expecting it to do. But the hope is, and it's been loud and clear that people want access, the hope is that we could look at a broader base of people living with the disease, whether it's inclusion in the clinical trial or looking at a broader population once the controlled portion is done, or looking at a subset and allowing a more broad population. Those are kind of the discussions that are ongoing now to hopefully make it more accessible to people who are in different stages of the disease. Because typically it is true that most clinical trials historically have kind of had a very stringent inclusion-exclusion criteria, really focused on a small percentage of people who are very, very early in their disease. So there's two things. One is thinking about the clinical trial eligibility criteria, but the other aspect is really trying to get the diagnosis earlier. That's a huge need in our community. So trying to raise awareness of what ALS is. So we had Lou Gehrig Day and trying to bring national, a national awareness or international awareness. Second, trying to make sure people get referred to those specialty centers and improving access, and hopefully thereby reducing that time and getting more people who are actually at their specialty clinics being eligible. So that's really the strategy we can do starting today.
And a third thing to that strategy is to remember it's not just about new treatments and finding new drugs, but it's also about the treatments that are in existence today, making sure they work in combination, making sure we can avoid people from getting complications of ALS. All of those require clinical research. And so even if someone is not able to test a new treatment, they can still help discover more effective ways to deliver care to people who have ALS now.
Thank you. And, I want to just kind of switch gears a little bit over to Carrie and Troy in terms of what you both have heard today and what we've heard in this discussion so far. What are some of your thoughts? And maybe we'll start with you, Troy, on specifically around clinical trials, since that seems to be a popular sort of question today. But what are some of your thoughts about what you've heard today, and maybe something that's inspiring you or something that has really resonated with you today?
Yeah, to me, we started, at least my part of the segment today, talking about what livable meant, what that goal meant. And I think that's a lot easier for me to grasp. The harder thing is how we get there. And so understanding the advancements in the science that can then push forward in bigger steps than we've seen to date, to be able to get us there, that's fairly significant. And so, again, something to be hopeful for.
Thank you, Troy. I appreciate that. And Carrie, you had talked very passionately about your family as caregivers, as well as the need for sometimes outside caregivers to come in as well. So is there anything else you'd like to say about the importance of caregivers? I know we're going to be talking about that a little bit more on day 3 of our conference this week when we talk about optimizing current treatments and care. But what are some of your thoughts on the importance of caregivers?
Well, I mean, our well-being as pals depends on good caregiving. So, just to reinforce, taking care of them is taking care of us.
That is an incredibly important point. And our caregivers are just absolutely critical in the everyday of living with this disease. I'm going to, I have more questions, unfortunately, than we probably have time to answer today. So I'll do my best to organize some of these questions to maybe try and respond to some of them over the next couple of days in our upcoming Q&A sessions tomorrow and Thursday. But Neil, I think that I'm going to end our session with just one last question for you. And that is specific to some of the timely information in the news around mRNA-based treatments, based therapies. Are there any clinical trials or treatments or investigations happening right now around mRNA-based therapies?
I actually would defer to Jinzi on that issue.
That's a tough question.
Yeah,
it is a tough question.
Referring to you
for ending, but what I will say is there actually. So I'm going to say probably it's miRNA is what you're probably trying to ask about. There's a lot of there is a lot of actually preclinical research and almost research in terms of like doing the animal testing to bring it into clinical trials. It is a promising technology that could be potentially useful in ALS, but it hasn't. I'm not aware of any that are currently in clinical trials in the U.S., but it's close.
Thanks, Jinzi. Sorry to be on the hardest question.
Neil, did you have anything to add?
Well, if they mean Antisense as mRNA, then we are doing some work in Antisense, and you know, a lot of that work is actually happening at Columbia, where Jinzi
lives. And I should add, so that's miRNA that I talked about. mRNA are trying to block, say, toxic proteins, right? That are translated from gene mutations. The two slides that I skipped, which were very critical, but in the essence of time, I skipped over them. But I will just that I do want to make a point of, so I might steal time here, but. It's important to know that when we know of a gene mutation in particular populations, there are technologies, gene-directed technologies that we could target for those gene mutations. So one of which Neil just mentioned is antisense oligonucleotide, ASOs, which is the most mature technologies being used in ALS. So one of which is tofersen, which is in phase 3, targeting SOD1 mutation. And actually the association was pivotal in trying to get that translational study off the ground into humans with ALS and SOD. The other ASO studies include C9, which is in early phase clinical development. And just recently, just a couple of months ago, antisense oligonucleotides were used to target the FUS mutation, FUS. And that really was made possible through collaborative funding with the association, along with Project ALS and an IONIS. So that kind of technology to use it in targeted population is being used. And there are other types of approaches for those genetic mutations that are in early phase or preclinical development, about to enter early phase 1 clinical trials. And so that is really what's kind of transforming the clinical trial landscape. If we know what's causing the disease, we could target therapy that could be impactful.
Thanks, Jinzi. I actually think that was a great way to end our discussion, because I have a lot of questions here specifically around how long it takes to get a diagnosis, what are the causes, and so forth. And so I think you kind of rounded out the discussion here today. So I'm going to end our Q&A session for now, but again, we have more Q&A sessions over the next couple of days. So keep those questions coming. So as a reminder, the Zoom exhibit experience, the Zoom exhibit booth experience, will be open at 5:15 Eastern today. So in just about 45 minutes from now. And you can visit our sponsors, and you can also submit your story in that Zoom booth experience. The booths will also be open tomorrow, beginning at 2:15 Eastern. And we will be back here tomorrow, same time, same place, at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll kick off our program talking about preventing and delaying harms of ALS. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good evening.